Grand Arbiter Vorath Kel had ruled the Galactic Conclave for 67 stellar cycles, and in all that time not once had he ever truly been afraid. Not when the Vorkai swarm consumed 3 outer systems in a single rotation. Not when the dreaming plague swept through the Nessun colonies and turned 2 billion sentient minds into vegetable matter. Not even when High Chancellor Bressa of the Thulian Imperium had pointed a plasma disruptor directly at his face and called it a diplomatic courtesy. Vorath Kel had stared down civilizations. He had bankrupted star systems with a signature. He had dissolved planetary governments the way most beings dissolved salt into water. Casually, without ceremony, without a second thought. He had never been afraid, right up until the moment he grabbed the human child. Let us back up because context, as the humans themselves are so fond of saying, is everything. The year was Conclave Standard 4412. The location was Nexus Prime, the central hub of galactic diplomacy. A station so vast it had its own gravitational pull and 3 functioning weather systems inside the eastern residential wing. Nexus Prime housed representatives from 412 recognized species, 17 contested species, and 1 species that was technically classified as a really organized fog by the Xenobiological Department. And now, as of approximately 14 months prior, it also housed humans. Earth had made first contact in the messiest, most uniquely human way imaginable. Their probe had not floated gracefully into conclave-monitored space with a carefully coded greeting. It had not broadcast universal mathematical sequences or harmonic frequency patterns. It had drifted in trailing a tangle of radio signals that included in no particular order, a soap opera episode, a livestock auction, 17 seasons of a competitive baking program, and something the translation committee still could not fully classify, but described as loud men arguing about a ball. The conclave had debated for 2 full cycles whether to respond. Senior Arbiter Duval Mosh of the Prethian Republic had argued loudly that any civilization capable of broadcasting something titled "I cannot believe you dropped the soufflé Marinda" should not be granted galactic citizenship. He was overruled, mostly because the rest of the council had quietly become addicted to the baking program and wanted more. Humanity was extended an invitation. What arrived at Nexus Prime was an ambassador named Petra Voss, a compact human female with gray-streaked dark hair, an expression that suggested she had personally witnessed every kind of institutional incompetence the universe had to offer, and a diplomatic record that included successfully brokering peace between 3 rival mining corporations, 2 separatist movements, and a very aggressive homeowners association on Earth's northern continent. She brought with her a staff of 12, and her daughter. Remy Voss was 8 years old, 41 inches tall, and constitutionally incapable of sitting still for more than 4 minutes. She had brown skin, a gap between her front teeth, 2 uneven braids that were always falling apart, and eyes that had a deeply unsettling habit of seeing things adults missed. She was, by the formal assessment of the Nexus Prime Behavioral Sciences Unit, an extremely small human in possession of an extremely large quantity of audacity. By the informal assessment of every species on the station, she was terrifying, not in an obvious way. She did not breathe fire. She did not emit paralytic toxins. She did not have natural armor plating or enhanced musculature or any of the biological advantages that caused the conclave to rate species on its standard threat matrix. Remy Voss was, physically speaking, about as threatening as a juvenile Pelian moss bunny. The difference was that moss bunnies did not ask questions. Remy Voss asked questions about everything. She asked the Thuelian ambassador why his secondary jaw moved independently of his primary jaw. She asked the Nessun delegate if her bioluminescent patches hurt when they changed color or if it was like a sneeze. She asked the station's head of security, a towering Vreth male named Court Yala, whether his exoskeleton ever itched and if he could scratch it himself or if he needed help. Court Yala, who had survived 4 active combat deployments and 1 hostage negotiation that lasted 11 days, did not know how to answer that question. He stood there for a full 30 seconds, which was the longest Court Yala had ever stood anywhere without having an action plan. "Itches sometimes," he admitted finally, in a voice that suggested he had never said anything so vulnerable in his life. Remy had nodded very seriously and said, "I could make you a back scratcher if you want. I made one for my mom out of a ruler and a fork." Court Yala did not take her up on the offer, but he thought about it for 3 days. Grand Arbiter Vorath Kel had been told about the human child the same way one is told about a persistent weather anomaly, as a footnote, as background noise, as something acknowledged and then appropriately ignored. He was a busy entity. He had a station to run. He had a conclave to manage. He had Duval Mosh to keep from starting 3 different political incidents before breakfast every morning, which alone was essentially a full-time occupation. He was not concerned about a small human child. He was, however, very concerned about the Kathrani dispute. The Kathrani system sat at the intersection of 4 territorial claims, 2 trade routes, and one extremely inconvenient prophecy from the Prothean sacred texts that claimed the system would one day produce the unmaking of the unworthy. 3 civilizations had submitted competing sovereignty claims. 2 of them had active warships in the area. One of them had started the whole dispute by accidentally mining an asteroid that the second civilization considered a holy site, which the third civilization considered proof that neither of them deserved the territory. Petra Voss had been invited to observe the conclave proceedings as part of Earth's orientation into galactic politics. Nobody had arranged childcare. This was, in retrospect, the mistake that started everything. Vorath Kale swept into the Grand Chamber on the morning of the 3rd day of Kathrani hearings, flanked by his full ceremonial guard, wearing the Arbiter's mantle, a deep violet robe studded with light-refracting crystals that cast prismatic shadows across every surface in a 10-meter radius. He was 8 feet tall, had 4 arms, a head shaped somewhat like a crescent moon turned sideways, and a presence that had historically caused lesser diplomats to forget their prepared speeches mid-sentence. He was the most powerful individual in this quadrant of the galaxy. He was running 12 minutes late because Duval Mosh had lodged a procedural objection to the seating arrangement. Again, and Vorath Kale had been forced to listen to 17 minutes of Prothean bureaucratic argument before he could credibly threaten to have Mosh reassigned to a monitoring post in the outer debris fields. He was, in summary, not in the most patient of moods. The Grand Chamber was packed. Every tier of the circular amphitheater was filled with representatives, aides, and observers. The viewing galleries along the upper ring housed press entities from 63 systems and one entity from the Fog Collective that was technically the press but also technically a cloud. Vorath swept down the central aisle toward the Arbiter's dais with the confidence of someone who had done this approximately 12,000 times. Delegates parted. Cameras tracked him. The ceremonial announcement tone rang through the chamber, and then something hit him directly in the shin. Not hard, not painfully. It was, objectively speaking, a minor physical contact. But it was so thoroughly unexpected that Vorath Kale, Grand Arbiter of the Galactic Conclave, the most powerful political figure in 4-star systems, stumbled. He did not fall. He was not a being who fell. But he stumbled, and his momentum carried him sideways and his lower left hand shot out instinctively for balance, and grabbed the nearest available object, which was Remy Voss, who had been crouching in the aisle, examining something on the floor, apparently having completely escaped the notice of every security check and staff member who was supposed to be ensuring she was somewhere that was not the Grand Chamber. His hand, which was roughly the size of her entire torso, closed around her middle and lifted her off the ground. There was a beat of silence. Then Remy Voss looked up at the 8-foot alien holding her in the air, looked around at the suddenly frozen Grand Chamber, looked at the 600 beings all staring at her, looked back at Vorath Kale's crescent moon face, and screamed at the top of her lungs, "We're all going to die." The Grand Chamber did not, technically, erupt. What happened was more of a controlled detonation. 3 delegates from the Thulian bloc knocked over their seating platform, scrambling backward. One of the Nessun representatives activated her bioluminescent distress signal, which was typically reserved for active predator encounters, bathing her entire section in blinding orange light. Kortyala, who had been stationed near the east entry, had his sidearm unholstered and leveled before his conscious mind had fully processed the situation. Every translation device in the chamber broadcast Remy's scream simultaneously in 412 languages, which created a cascading echo effect that took approximately 8 full seconds to fully die out. Duval Mosh, who had been 3 seconds away from launching into his prepared remarks about the seating arrangement, instead fell completely off his chair. Nobody helped him up. They were all too busy staring at the child. Vorath Kale stood very still, holding Remy Voss in the air, and processed what had just happened. His neural cortex, which was a genuinely impressive piece of biological engineering that could run 12 concurrent logical threads simultaneously, managed exactly one thought. What? Remy Voss, dangling at approximately eye level, looked back at him with an expression that contained several things Vorath Kale could not immediately name. He would later identify them as excitement, zero fear, academic curiosity, and the specific kind of satisfaction a small being gets when they have accidentally caused a very large disruption. "Hi," she said. Vorath Kale said nothing. His 12 concurrent logical threads were still stuck on what? "You have really cool robes," Remy continued, apparently unbothered by the fact that she was being held in the air by a stranger in front of 600 people. "The light things are neat. Are they crystals? My teacher says crystals aren't actually magic, but she also said spiders weren't dangerous, and then one bit Marcus on the field trip and his arm got really big. Someone in the gallery made a noise that was either a suppressed laugh or a suppressed sob. It was genuinely difficult to tell. Vorath Kale's brain completed its reboot cycle and arrived at language. "You," he said, in his most authoritative voice, "the one that had ended careers and halted wars, should not be here." Remy tilted her head. "I know. Mom said the same thing, but I followed the guy with the tall hat because I wanted to see where he was going, and then I was in here and the doors closed and I couldn't figure out how to leave without walking past the big guard, and he looks mean." Every eye in the chamber turned to Court Yala. Court Yala, who did indeed look mean, holstered his weapon very slowly and developed an intense interest in a patch of wall to his left. "Why?" Vorath Kale said carefully, still holding Remy in the air. Because putting her down seemed like a decision that required more processing than he currently had available. "Did you scream that we were all going to die?" Remy blinked. "Because you grabbed me, and I thought maybe you were going to eat me, and in the movies when a monster grabs someone it's usually bad." The chamber produced a sound that took Vorath Kale several seconds to identify. It was laughter. Not polite, diplomatic, carefully managed laughter. Actual laughter. From multiple species, in different registers and frequencies and biological configurations, rolling through the grand chamber of the Galactic Conclave like a wave. The Nessun delegates' bioluminescent patches cycled through 4 different colors. A Vreth in the 3rd tier made a sound like a kettle boiling. Even one of Vorath Kale's own ceremonial guards was experiencing what could only be described as a smile, which was technically a dereliction of duty. Vorath Kale was not used to being laughed at. He was also, and this was the more troubling realization, not used to feeling the specific sensation that was currently occurring in his chest, which he tentatively identified as the urge to laugh himself. He suppressed it. He was the Grand Arbiter. He had an image to maintain. "I am not," he said with considerable dignity, "a monster." "Okay," Remy said. "You're really tall though." "Yes." "Why do you have 4 arms?" "Because I was born with 4 arms." "That's really cool. I only have 2. It's annoying sometimes, like when I'm carrying groceries and I want to open a door." Vorath Kale became aware that 600 beings were watching this conversation with the focused attention of a species encountering something they had never seen before and were not sure how to classify. He carefully set Remy Voss down on the floor. She immediately looked up at him with the full intensity of a small creature who had decided, unilaterally and without consulting anyone, that this was the beginning of a friendship. "What's your name?" she asked. "Grand Arbiter Vorath Kale, ruler of the Conclave and presiding authority of the galactic proceedings." She considered this for a moment. "Can I call you Vor?" "Absolutely not." "Okay, Vor." Ambassador Petra Voss arrived in the Grand Chamber 4 minutes later at a dead sprint, which was itself a notable event because Petra Voss was not a person who ran. She negotiated. She maneuvered. She outmaneuvered people who thought they were outmaneuvering her. She did not sprint. She sprinted now. She arrived through the east entry, saw her daughter standing at the Arbiter's dais next to the Grand Arbiter himself, apparently explaining something to him using very large hand gestures, and stopped so suddenly she almost fell over. Court Yala caught her by the elbow. "She is fine," he said, in a tone that communicated several things simultaneously. That yes, he was aware a child had bypassed 3 security checkpoints and entered a restricted chamber during a high-level political proceeding, and that yes, he acknowledged this was technically his responsibility, and that no, he did not want to discuss how it had happened. Petra looked at her daughter. She looked at the Grand Arbiter, who was listening to Remy with what appeared to be reluctant attention. She looked at the 600 spectators who were watching the scene with expressions ranging from delighted to baffled to deeply concerned about the structural integrity of their reality. She took a breath. She walked to the dais with the measured calm of someone who had spent 20 years learning that the key to surviving any situation was to never let anyone see you. Panicking, even when you were internally absolutely panicking. "Arbiter Kale," she said, "I offer my most sincere apologies. My daughter was not supposed to be here. I will remove her immediately." Vorath Kale looked at Petra. He looked at Remy, who was looking at him with an expression that clearly communicated she was not done with the conversation they had been having and was prepared to resume it at the earliest available opportunity. "Your daughter," Vorath Kale said slowly, "has just explained to me, in considerable detail, why the Kathrani dispute is being handled incorrectly." Petra blinked. "I'm sorry," she said, "and I am summarizing, that we are all arguing about who owns the asteroid when the real question is why anyone needs to own it, and whether the 3 parties could share it the way she shares her classroom art supplies." Vorath Kale paused. She used the words, "You're all being really dumb about this." but I have chosen to interpret that as diplomatic shorthand. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that happens when something very small says something very obvious that very large beings have been walking past for months without noticing. Petra looked at Remy. Remy shrugged with the loose confidence of someone who had not yet learned that she was supposed to be intimidated by rooms full of powerful beings. "The glowy people over there look really sad," she said, pointing at the Nessun delegation. "And the big purple ones look really mad. And the ones with the extra eyes look scared. Maybe if everyone calmed down first they could just talk. That's what Mom always says." Duval Mosh, who had finally been helped back into his chair by a deeply embarrassed aide, opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in 67 stellar cycles, Vorath Kale found himself thinking that the most interesting thing in the Grand Chamber was not the political crisis on the table, but the 41-inch human who had wandered in by accident and was taking notes in a small green book she had produced from somewhere in her clothing. He did not know what to do with that. He would spend the rest of the day not knowing what to do with it. And then, the following morning, everything got significantly worse. The morning after Remy Voss accidentally derailed a 600-delegate galactic hearing, Nexus Prime woke up to something it had never experienced before, a viral moment. The conclave did not officially have a press problem. It had a press situation which was different because a problem implied something had gone wrong, and the station's communications director, a meticulous Prathian named Balo Dren, spent considerable energy insisting that nothing had gone wrong. What had happened was, in his carefully chosen words, an unscheduled procedural interruption resulting in an organic exchange of perspectives. The footage told a different story. Every recording device in the Grand Chamber had captured the moment Vorath Kale stumbled, grabbed Remy, lifted her into the air and stood there holding a gap-toothed human child, while 600 of the galaxy's most powerful beings watched in paralyzed silence. The scream, "We're all going to die," had been translated simultaneously into 412 languages and broadcast on the station's open frequency before anyone had thought to cut the feed. By morning it had reached 38 star systems. By noon it had reached 80. By the time Baldren finished drafting his official statement describing the incident as an organic exchange of perspectives, a Thulian entertainment network had already produced a comedic reenactment featuring puppet versions of Vorath Kale and Remy, and it had more viewers than the actual Kathrani hearings. Vorath Kale read the viewership numbers over his morning nutrition cycle and set down his beverage very carefully. "Balo," he said. "Yes, Arbiter. Find the child." Remy Voss was, at that precise moment, in Section 14C of the residential wing, teaching Court Yala how to play a card game. She had produced the cards from the same mysterious pocket dimension in her clothing that had previously yielded the green notebook, 2 pieces of string, a partially eaten nutrition bar, a rock she described as a really good rock, and a small folded photograph of a dog. The card game had no consistent rules. Remy had explained it 3 times, and each explanation was different. Court Yala, who had a tactical mind capable of processing 17 variables simultaneously in active combat situations, had been playing for 40 minutes and still could not determine the win condition. "You just know when you win," Remy said helpfully. "That is not how games work," Court Yala said. "It's how this game works." Court Yala looked at his cards. He looked at her cards. He looked at the stack in the middle, which Remy called the maybe pile, and which appeared to operate on entirely different logic than the rest of the game. "I think I'm winning," he said. "You're not," Remy said immediately. "How can you tell?" "I just know." Court Yala set his cards down. "This game," he said, with the measured restraint of someone who had survived 4 combat deployments, "is deeply unfair." Remy grinned. The gap in her teeth was particularly pronounced when she grinned. "Yeah," she agreed cheerfully. "That's kind of the point." It was at this exact moment that the door to Section 14C slid open and 2 of Vorath Kel's ceremonial guards stepped in, followed by the Grand Arbiter himself, who was still wearing the full mantle and still casting prismatic light across every available surface, which in the relatively modest residential corridor created an effect that was both impressive and mildly disorienting. Remy looked up. "Hi, Vor. I told you not to call me that." "I know," she said, with the specific tone of someone who had noted the instruction and decided it did not apply to her. Court Yala stood up very quickly and attempted to subtly hide the playing cards, which was not subtle at all. Vorath Kale looked at his head of station security, who was holding a fistful of brightly colored cards, sitting on the floor of a residential corridor, having apparently been playing a game with a small human child on duty hours. "Court Yala," he said. "Arbiter," Court said. "At attention now. Cards still in hand. We will discuss this later." "Yes, Arbiter." Vorath Kale lowered himself to one knee, which was the closest he could get to being at Remy's eye level without sitting on the floor himself, and looked at her. She looked back at him with that same expression she'd had in the grand chamber, direct, unafraid, tilted slightly with curiosity, as though he were an interesting problem she was working on. "I need to speak with you," he said, "about what you said yesterday." Remy considered this. "The dying thing? Because I said sorry about that already. I didn't actually think you were going to eat me. I just panicked. Not the dying thing. What you said about the Kathrani dispute." She blinked. "The asteroid thing? Yes. Oh." She pulled her green notebook out of her pocket. "I wrote some more stuff down last night, because I was thinking about it, and I think the sad glowy people are sad because the other ones took something that mattered to them and nobody said sorry. And nobody said sorry because they didn't think they did anything wrong because they didn't know it mattered." She paused. "My friend Deja at home used to draw on my stuff because she thought I didn't care about drawing stuff, and I got really mad. And then I told her I cared, and she said sorry, and then we were fine." Vorath Kale stared at her. "It took us like 5 minutes," Remy added, "but we were 8. Maybe it takes longer when you're old." From somewhere behind Vorath Kale, one of his guards made a sound that was technically a cough. "You are suggesting," Vorath Kale said slowly, "that the Kathrani dispute could be resolved with an apology, and probably sharing," Remy said, "but the apology part first, otherwise the sharing feels fake." Vorath Kale did not go directly back to the Grand Chamber. He went to his private office, which occupied the entire upper section of the station's central spire, and had a view of open space on 3 sides, and a collection of political treaties spanning 400 years on the 4th. He sat behind his desk and stared at the space in front of him for a long time. He thought about the Kathrani dispute. He thought about the 17 formal sessions that had produced nothing but procedural filings and competing legal arguments. He thought about the warships sitting in the outer belt of the system, their weapons powered down but their crews ready, the way a fist is ready even when it's not yet swinging. He thought about a gap-toothed 8-year-old with 2 uneven braids explaining conflict resolution with the relaxed certainty of someone who had never learned to be afraid of simple answers. Then he called his senior diplomatic staff into the office and presented what he was about to describe as a new framework for the Kathrani proceedings. His senior advisor, a long-tenured Vreth named Ashra Mol, looked at the notes he had written, and then looked at him. "Arbiter," she said carefully. This is not a standard conclave framework. No. Where did you develop this?" Vorath Kale was quiet for a moment. "Research," he said. Ashra Mol looked at the notes again. In the margin, in his handwriting, were the words Deja plus drawing stuff, underlined twice. She decided not to ask. The second session of the Kathrani hearings opened the following morning, and it opened differently. Vorath Kale was on time, which alone caused Duval Mosh to look suspicious. He entered without the full ceremonial guard, which caused Ashra Mol to look concerned, and when he reached the arbiter's dais and called the session to order, the first thing he said was not a procedural statement or a summary of the previous day's arguments. He said, "Before we continue, I would like the record to reflect something that has not yet been acknowledged in this chamber." The chamber went very quiet. The Nessun delegation has filed 14 requests for a formal acknowledgement that the Preethian mining operation disturbed a site of spiritual and cultural significance to their people. He looked at the Preethian block. Those requests have been met with procedural counters and legal challenges. Not denials, but not answers. He paused. "That ends today." Duval Mosh stood up. "Arbiter, the legal standing of the site classification has not been fully established." "Sit down, Duval." Duval sat down. Possibly because of the tone. Possibly because Vorath Kale had 4 arms and was currently using all of them to grip the edge of the dais in a way that suggested he was very close to the end of his patience. "The site was sacred to the Nessun," Vorath Kale said. "That is not a legal question. That is a fact, and it will be acknowledged as a fact in this chamber before any other business proceeds." The silence that followed had texture to it. The Nessun delegation sat very still, their bioluminescent patches doing something Vorath Kale had not seen them do before, cycling slowly through a warm gold color that his recently consulted xenobiological briefing identified as an emotional response associated with being heard. Ban Velour, the lead Preethian delegate, stood. He was a heavy-set being with 4 eyes and a reputation for never conceding anything. He stood there for a long moment, and everyone in the chamber could see the calculation happening behind his face. Then he said, in a voice that was careful and deliberate and only slightly pained, "The Preethian delegation acknowledges that the site in question held significant cultural and spiritual meaning to the Nessun people. We further acknowledge that the mining operation, while conducted under what we believe to be legal authorization, caused harm that we did not intend but must recognize. He sat down quickly, as though the words had cost him something and he wanted to stop spending. The chamber was silent. Then the lead Nessun delegate, a tall bioluminescent being named Sile Oren, rose slowly. Her patches were still cycling gold. The Nessun delegation accepts that acknowledgement, she said quietly, and thanks the Prothean delegation for offering it. And just like that, with no legal filings and no procedural framework and no 17-stage formal process, something that had been locked for 11 months moved. Oshra Mol, standing at the side of the dais, looked at her notes, and then looked at the ceiling for a moment in the specific way of someone recalibrating their understanding of how things work. The joint stewardship proposal took 4 days to finalize. It was not simple. Nothing involving 400 years of territorial claims and 3 active military presences is ever simple. There were late-night sessions and heated arguments, and at least one moment where Duval Mosh attempted to file a procedural objection to the word joint on the grounds that it implied a legal equivalency he did not recognize, and Vorath Kale had to take him outside the chamber and have a conversation that nobody heard but that resulted in Duval returning with a noticeably different posture. But the framework held, because the apology had been real, and once it was real, the sharing became possible. On the 4th night, after the provisional agreement had been signed by all 3 parties, Vorath Kale walked through the residential wing of Nexus Prime by himself, without his guard, without his mantle. He was carrying the signed documents and thinking about nothing in particular. He passed Section 14C. The door was open. Inside, Remy Voss was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, green notebook in her lap, apparently drawing something. Petra Voss was at a small desk nearby, working on something of her own, and the room had the specific quiet of 2 people who are comfortable being in the same space without talking. Remy looked up and saw him. "Did you fix the asteroid thing?" she asked. Vorath Kale stood in the doorway. "Provisionally," he said. "There is still work to be done. But you said sorry first?" He considered the diplomatic complexity of the last 4 days, the legal architecture, the 17 competing claims, the military presence, the procedural history. "Yes," he said. "We said sorry first." Remy nodded as though this confirmed something she had already known. "Good," she said, and went back to her drawing. Petra Voss had turned in her chair and was watching Vorath Kale with an expression he had learned to recognize in the last week. Carefully neutral, professionally calm, with something underneath that was either amusement or respect, or possibly both. "She really did help," Petra said quietly. "She did not help," Vorath Kale said. "She walked into a restricted chamber uninvited, caused a security incident, and told 600 delegates they were being dumb. And," he was quiet, "and resolved an 11-month diplomatic standstill in approximately 4 minutes of floor time," he said, with the tone of someone admitting something against their own will. Petra smiled. It was a very small smile, but it was genuine, and Vorath Kale had the distinct impression that it did not emerge frequently. "She's always been like this," Petra said. "She doesn't see the walls. She just walks through them because she doesn't know she's supposed to stop." Vorath Kale looked at Remy, who was now holding up her green notebook to show him what she had been drawing. It was a picture of him. 8 feet tall, 4 arms, crescent moon head, the mantle casting little zigzag lines that were apparently meant to represent the prismatic light effect. In the picture, he was holding a small figure in the air. The small figure had 2 uneven braids and a big gap-toothed grin, and both its arms raised like it was on a ride at an amusement park. It did not look like a monster grabbing a child. It looked like something entirely different. "Can I keep this?" he heard himself ask. Remy's grin widened until the gap in her front teeth was fully visible. "I made it for you," she said. "I was going to give it to you anyway." The Kathrani agreement was formally ratified 18 days later, in a ceremony that was covered by press entities from 211 systems and watched by more beings than any previous conclave proceeding in history. The puppet reenactment was still circulating. Someone had added music to it. Balodren had stopped trying to write official statements about it and had instead taken up a hobby involving small plants, which he described as therapeutic. At the ratification ceremony, Vorath Kale gave the address. It was a good address. It covered the legal framework, the historical significance, the path forward for all 3 parties. It was dignified and authoritative and appropriately ceremonial. At the very end, he said something that was not in the prepared remarks. He said, "The resolution of this dispute did not come from legal frameworks or procedural expertise. It came from a reminder that before any negotiation, before any proposal, before any framework, Someone has to tell the truth about what happened, and someone has to say they are sorry that it did. He paused. We were reminded of this by someone with considerably more wisdom than experience, who stumbled into this chamber unannounced and saw with complete clarity what several hundred trained diplomats had been walking past for nearly a year. In the gallery 6 rows back, Remy Voss sat between her mother and Court Yala, who had quietly rearranged his duty schedule to be there. She was wearing her regular clothes, not diplomatic attire, because she had refused to wear the formal outfit Petra had suggested on the grounds that it made her look like a plant. When Vorith Kale finished speaking, she clapped very enthusiastically, which caused the beings around her to clap as well, and then most of the gallery was clapping, and it was unclear if they were clapping for the speech or for the ratification, or because the small human had started it, and momentum is a powerful thing. Vorith Kale looked at the gallery. He found her in 6 rows back without much difficulty, because she was the only being in the room who was clapping with her whole body, both arms going, braids bouncing. He inclined his head very slightly, in a gesture that in his culture meant something between thank you and this is acknowledged. Remy beamed and gave him a thumbs up. Court Yala watched this and decided, quietly, that he was going to take her up on the back-scratcher offer. 3 months after the ratification, the conclave received a formal diplomatic communication from Earth's governing assembly. It contained the standard protocols, the updated credentials for Ambassador Petra Voss, and a note at the bottom in very small text that said Earth would appreciate it if any future incidents involving the ambassador's daughter could be considered. For the record, unofficial diplomatic contributions rather than security breaches. The request was, technically not within standard conclave procedure. Vorith Kale approved it immediately without sending it to committee. Balo Dren found out 3 days later and had a reaction best described as a man who has run out of the specific energy required to be surprised. The formal record of the Nexus Prime security logs was updated. The incident on the day of the 3rd Kathrani hearing was reclassified from unauthorized entry by civilian minor to unscheduled contribution by informal diplomatic consultant. Remy Voss, age 8, became the youngest entity in conclave history to hold any kind of diplomatic classification. She was never told this because Petra Voss made a judgment call that her daughter did not need additional encouragement. The green notebook with the drawing of Vorith Kale was kept in his office, in the small space between the 400-year-old treaties and the view of open space. Not framed, not archived, just there, on the corner of the desk, where he could see it. On days when the proceedings were long and Duval Mash had filed more procedural objections than seemed biologically possible, and the weight of 412 recognized species and 17 contested ones and 1 fog pressed on him from every direction, Vorith Kale, Grand Arbiter of the Galactic Conclave, looked at a crayon drawing made by a 41-inch human child, and remembered that sometimes the most important thing any room full of powerful beings could do was the simplest. Stop arguing about who owned the asteroid, say sorry, share the art supplies, and maybe, just maybe, listen to whoever stumbled in and said the obvious thing that everyone else was too afraid to say. Out in the Kathrani system, the asteroid that had started it all sat exactly where it had always sat, at the intersection of 4 territorial claims and 2 trade routes and 1 old prophecy about the unmaking of the unworthy. Under the Joint Stewardship Agreement, a small monitoring station was constructed on its surface. It was staffed by rotating crews from all 3 civilizations. It had a common room. The common room had a table. On the table, someone had placed a set of colored pencils and a stack of blank paper. Nobody remembered who put them there first. Nobody asked.